Welcome back for episode 3 of the Astronomical Apocrypha, the Seleukid Empire Let's Play series for Rome 2 with Dividae at Impera. Last time Antiochos Soter rededicated his army to the Babylonian god Marduk, an act intended to appease his Babylonian soldiers at the expense of the Greek opinion. Pergamon were enticed into war with Koinon Galaton, who hastily offered up the bulk of their wealth to turn aside Seleukid wrath. In the end, the Galatians were conquered and later obliterated by Pergamon. Together with Cordylion, the lovelorn admiral of the Heralds of Triton, Antiochus launched an overwhelming two-pronged assault by land and by sea against the Kypros settlement at Sidey, destroying the faction's military power and capturing their Anatolian coastal settlement. The counterstrike from Ptolemy came so quickly it was undoubtedly planned well in advance of the instigating act. Archelaus, commander of the Hammers of Hephaestus, died in the defense, but his sacrifice was not in vain as the Ptolemaic thrust was turned aside and their army broken. With Ptolemy's play for Syria rebuked, and the Cypriots cowering behind their walls of Kypros, Antiochus and his son looked to press their advantage, but with the treasury drained and the mercenary pirates of the Levantine Sea demanding their pay, the greatest obstacle to overcome at this moment is the imperial ledger.
Are you absolutely sure of this? You know that he'll go out alone when the moon is full.
Not alone, but with a sparse bodyguard, 1 man or 2. His Babylonian astrologers have infected his mind with their sky reading. He's looking for omens, and if it can be believed, a sign of good fortune from their moon god, Sin.
Thank Tyche for this gift. She will not have looked kindly upon him for his act of contempt. Should we wait longer for more conspirators to join?
No, we cannot wait any longer. Seleukos the Younger supports our cause, but the more success Antiochos Soter has in Asia, the fewer men will challenge his ideas about multiculturalism. Tyche has deserted the king, and Nemesis sharpens her blade tonight.
Aside from Kypros and the Ptolemies, I'm still at war with 2 of our former satrapies to the east, Takashila and Haraiva. Since I have no designs on either of these small factions for the moment, I couldn't reach them to strike them even if I wanted to. I'll try again and see what, if anything, they would be willing to pay to end their war with the superpower like the Seleukid state. Not much it turns out, but Haraiva are at least willing to part with the nominal sum of 1,000 talents, although Takashila just acted insulted by the suggestion.
Like your whores. You think pride and honor are for sale? Bah!
The small infusion of cash from the Haraiva peace deal has at least removed the immediate threat of bankruptcy, and I'm also able to take a bit of the sting out of the seasonal deficit by raising our taxes temporarily to the moderately high level. The only place that the public order penalty would make a difference is in Ankara, which I have already exempted from tax. This will at least let us extend Cordylion's adventures with his navy inflated with the mercenaries for a couple more turns, provided I don't spend any more money. Lastly, I've begun demolition of another Tier 2 military building I can't currently use to give me another small boost to income next turn. Before I end the turn, I have a level up for Eudokia, my noblewoman at Seleukia. I promise not to bore you with each level up, but I did notice at this point that Eudokia has a terrible trait called hot-headed. This trait impairs growth, empire maintenance, and construction costs, with a slight boost to cultural conversion. This is quite frankly not what we want for one of our dignitaries, and certainly not the administrator of Seleukia. I decide to go full throttle in picking her skills to suit her personality, choosing public orator and political zealot, each of which will help her against enemy agents, and improve her cultural conversion, so she might at least be of some use on the frontier. With that done, I also decide to match her environment to her personality, sending her off into the sweltering Arabian desert of Kedar. Again, we've got troop desertion from the dragons, perhaps since they're embarked at sea, although I'm not clear how this mechanic is supposed to work since they just left port last turn. Seasickness apparently being kryptonite for the Dragons of Bel-Marduk, Cordylion puts the delicate army ashore in northern Kypros, while the Heralds of Triton circle around the island to ring the port in their blockade. With Antiochos about to march on the city, there will be no respite or escape for the inhabitants. I also bring Eurydice ashore next to the city to see if she'll be able to pull off her assassination attempt on the Cypriot general as requested by our allies in the last episode. I'm not sure why exactly, but the AI decide here to gamble on a desperate attempt to break Cordylion's blockade. It's true they're definitely in trouble with Antiochos on his way, but they stand absolutely no chance on the water against Cordylion, as evidenced by the balance bar, which is heavily in my favor. The game is predicting a heroic victory with moderate losses of about 15 to 20% of the force in the auto-resolve. Especially since many of these are mercenaries I plan to disband anyway, I think this is totally appropriate for an auto-resolve. The result turns out just as predicted, a heroic victory with about 15% losses. I also get a large number of captives from this, who I'm going to take as slaves. Knossos wisely are looking to get on our good side after Antiochus' show of force in Asia Minor, and they are now asking for trade. I can use the income for now, so I accept their terms. The only downside to Bacchus' crazed and ill-fated gambit at Kypros is that he has denied Eurydice her objective of dispatching him quietly. Cordylion and his navy keep growing in strength, and although I'm sure we are dwarfed by the naval strength of nations like Egypt or Carthage, the man is quickly making a name for himself on the Phoenician coast. Lastly, we learn that the Kedarites and the Nabataeans have stopped their mutual destruction. While this might seem like inconsequential news, the peace between these brother nations has consequences I did not appreciate at the time. For now, Antiochus and the Dragons of Bel-Marduk swiftly close in on what little garrison remains at Salamis, which has been gutted of its defense by the naval misadventures of the now deceased Cypriot king. There's no challenge to be had in this city assault. None of our men were killed in the assault, although I'm told 16 soldiers were lost to alcohol poisoning in the Bacchanalian celebrations that followed the triumph. This marks the end of Kypros and Antiochus' unification of the Kilikkian province. I set up the Bread and Games Edict to slow the decline of public order in the wake of the occupation and recolonization of Kypros. Their tasks complete, I begin dispersing the conquering forces. Deprived of her mission, Eurydice sets sail for Tyros to put her talents to work against the Ptolemies, and Cordylion disbands his mercenary ships that comprise the bulk of his fleet. The stiff mercenary wage is gone. This has in turn solved our financial crisis, and now with over 3,000 income per turn, I'm empowered to reduce the taxes back to medium level, although Ankara still is not sufficiently converted from Gallic culture to enable me to reinstitute taxation layer. We now control the requisite 13 settlements, and per the Chapter 1 title, we have found favor in our undertakings, getting a very nice total of 9,000 in wealth influx as a reward for the unification of Cilicia and committing to a war with Egypt. I came up just short of being able to complete the third objective, the capture of Judea, but now at least that goal is in reach for its own merit. Chapter 2 will require us to amass the military might to further our empire, the main goal being to control 60 units. We aren't too far away from this, already controlling 40 of the required 60 units. The bonuses for this chapter include making a satrapy of Egypt, controlling 10 naval units, securing an alliance with the Antigonids, and controlling 8 satrapies total, of which we only have 3 currently after the mass exodus of the upper satrapies. With the completion of water sluicing, I'm going to continue down the research path that begets more research, targeting astronomy on the way to natural philosophy that will let us further upgrade our libraries. I'm also building my first library now in Antioch. With a huge sum of wealth to spend, I want to start the somewhat prohibitively expensive undertaking of upgrading more of my core settlements to Tier 2, primarily so I'll have the stronger garrison to rely upon. I start with Karax in the Persian Gulf, and also start working on my very important settlement of Antioch. What's left of the massive cash influx I use to bolster my forces, with Cordylion getting a couple more ships of his own to replace the mercenaries, and Antiochus II adding 3 units of hoplite, a generic but strong fighting regiment of Greek spearmen. There's a Persian army now hanging around Seleukid, which makes me a bit nervous, although they remain on friendly terms in spite of their strong cultural aversion, on the basis of our mutual enemies. Nevertheless, I don't trust any of my satrapies really, and I start pulling Diogenes and the hammers of Hephaestus back toward Babylon and Seleucia. On her way to Egypt, Eurydice stumbles across a Ptolemaic champion, who she's able to wound with poison, knocking the leopard pelt-wearing brave of the king out of action for a little while. The Dragons of Bel-Marduk have this turn reached land and have enough movement to head north into our allies' territory of Mazaca, on the way to Pontus, who block our route to the Black Sea. I've added a couple more units to Antiochos II's army, some Achairophori of our own, and Eudokia continues passing through the Arabian desert on her way to the Seal Syria provinces of Ptolemy. During the intern phase, a small Ptolemaic force appears on the western border of Judea with Egypt, but they pose little threat by themselves. Takashila have rethought their position for peace, now making an entreaty to us, but they still aren't willing to pay, and I'm not letting any former satrapy off the hook without some form of recompense. There's news from the western Mediterranean now of Roman troops in Sicily, apparently the tensions between the two powers reaching a boiling point. Nevertheless, we remain half a world away from the conflict for now. Meanwhile, we have our own problems which are closer to the heart of our nation than I could have imagined.
I'm at a loss, Euclid, for if the moon god wishes to make his will known to me tonight, then I cannot grasp the meaning. Perhaps you could help me with some of the astronomical calculations. You're well known for your facility with geometry.
Please, King, do not mock me. I'm only a loyal soldier with no aptitude for mathematics, my namesake notwithstanding. Wait, do you hear that?
Soldiers there, I can see you emblazoned with the Seleukid anchor, but come out of the brush. It concerns me that you skulk in the presence of your king.
You are king of the Easterners and no longer speak for loyal Macedonians. We pledge our arms to Seleukos the Younger, and with his assent, we shall end you.
The conspirators' words were almost incoherent, so enraged had they become by the perceived threat to the purity of their Hellenic culture. But I did understand that they felt Tyche, the daughter of power and the sister of revenge, had abandoned me, and perhaps she had. But other gods also had a stake in my fate. After the sword slid between my ribs, I both felt and heard the air whistling into my chest. My father told me that Alexander received an injury just like this, albeit from a spear point, not a sword. I would have died, if not for Euclid's valor and speed. It was by Sin's light that he carried me back to camp.
Antiochos Soter escaped immediate death, but suffered a serious injury. It remains to be seen if he will live, but he'll be sidelined for a period of time at least. With the king injured, I have to select a new general to lead the Dragons of Bel-Marduk. I have a number of choices, two of which come from the Seleukid dynasty, probably representing loyal cousins or retainers rather than descendants of the king, of which there are only two males, the disowned son Seleukos and the younger son and heir Antiochos II. Although his attributes are the weakest of the three, I eventually settle on a promising young captain named Euclid, providing him with a bodyguard of royal peltasts, a unit I haven't had the opportunity to use yet. He's set on continuing Antiochus' original aims without deviation, bringing the army further north into Mazaca, right up to the border with Pontus-held Amasia. At the near side of Egypt, Eurydice is investigating the Egyptian force there, evidently a recreated Pride of Bast that is a shadow of its former glory, led by a new general Georgius and his pike phalanx alongside another middle tier phalanx regiment, and a strong unit of Egyptian archers. Although I'm not threatened by the Pride of Bast, I don't want them getting into Jerusalem before I do, so I bring the thunderbolts of Zeus south to lay siege to Jerusalem. The city has a large but relatively weak garrison composed mostly of local levies alongside a few regiments of local archers. I'm given the edge in the balance bar, but with huge casualties predicted in the auto-resolve, I decide not to assault the city for now, instead electing to see whether a siege might entice them to foolish acts of bravado like their allies, the Cypriots. I want to keep the Pride of Bast out of the mix for now, so I try to slow down their progress by arranging to have Eurydice steal their provisions, but she's unsuccessful. Although income has taken a sharp reduction from the influx of troops and ships into our forces, I'm now able to safely tax Galatia, with Olympias having improved her public order there to a net positive change per turn. With that said, the province is still quite poor and only provides 400 income between the two settlements. Whatever wound Antiochos has sustained, it is evidently quite serious as he hasn't returned the following season, nor will he for several more turns at least. There's conflict in full swing in the east, with Bactria and Parthiva at one another's throats, and Hariva having been wiped off the map. Antiochos II still has Judea under siege while his father recuperates. The Thunderbolts have taken a very slight degree of attrition, while it's still another 7 turns to force the defenders to capitulate, and they seem to have been unwilling to sally out during the end turn phase. Although I've yet to see a strong advancing army from Egypt, I don't wait around for a Ptolemaic counterattack, so I've decided to go forward with a settlement assault. As noted before, the defenders are mostly local levies of spearmen and some local archers, although the archers are actually quite dangerous for garrison troops, according to their stats. It's a partially overcast but still sweltering day in the southern Levant, and you can see the ripples of heat rising from the hot sandy ground. Jerusalem is an unwalled open settlement with several approaches from just about any angle. The Egyptians have wasted no time in erecting a stele in the central square that is covered in hieroglyphs. I've arranged my infantry at a long line stretching from the west to the south, where there are at least 3 nearby entrances. I don't want to divide my forces too much to avoid having a small detachment wiped out by a dedicated enemy counterattack. The 2 light cavalry units are placed off to the right, on the southern end of the map, while I keep Antiochos II behind the main infantry line for his morale buff and commander skills. As my infantry start moving into position, the enemy are swarming toward the central stele and sending a few units toward the western entrances. I'm leading with my 3 pike phalanxes to make the frontal assault on the 2 westernmost entrances. As they arrive and begin slowly moving into the settlement, I bring archers around the periphery to launch some volleys over the top, while I split the Mycairophori away to the north and the Hyrcanian hillmen make their way around the southern edge of the settlement. The pikes have locked in melee with some of the Greek garrison spearmen and native citizen militia spears, and in each of these battles the Seleukid phalanx should have the upper hand, although I'm forced to contend with 2 of the enemy archer regiments launching their arrows into my men, which takes a particular toll on my weaker levy pikemen at the southwestern entrance. The Mycairophori make their way down each of the 2 northern settlement entrances, although outnumbered by a large group of enemies holding back from the central capture point. My melee infantry should have the upper hand in a one-on-one battle, in a narrow city street where flanking is not possible. However, the enemy make no move to counter the Mycairophori yet, and now I have an opening to rear charge the Greek garrison defending against my pikemen. As this is happening, my hoplite regiments have reached the southeastern entrance, and it's there that the bulk of the remaining enemy have decided to resist my advance, suddenly throwing most of their uncommitted troops at the advancing Seleukid spearmen. This has given the cavalry an opening to circle around to the east to find the gap in the enemy's defense, and hopefully to sow mayhem and destruction once inside behind the enemy line. The settlement commander, Alexander, also has a garrison spear regiment of his own that is the remaining uncommitted wildcard inside the settlement, although he seems more interested in blocking the hoplites from the south, so I bring my light cavalry inside and immediately send them after the vulnerable archer units. By this time, my first group of pikemen and the Mycairophori on the west have broken the defenders there and begin making their way into the settlement to set up a devastating hammer strike on the rear of the garrison defenders blocking my other phalanx on the southwest. The horsemen continue marauding through the settlement, smashing through the relatively defenseless local archers in the process, and I decide to send half their number in against the rear of the southeastern defenders, including the enemy general, just to see if I can tip the scales far enough into my favor to precipitate a chain rout. This does break one of the town militia regiments there, but the garrison commander is not so easily dissuaded from battle, and he and his men continue to fight. I pull out the 1st regiment of cavalry and then send in the 2nd for another charge, cycle charging the defenders in this manner. My pikes have approached the rear of the western defenders, and it barely takes the threat of facing long spears from every direction for the men's morale to fail. And it's at this point, with the defenders at the southern settlement trapped between the hoplites and the horsemen, that the remainder routed, and the battle immediately terminates as a victory for Antiochos II. This was a fairly good result for us, particularly given the predicted 50% losses on the auto-resolve. We lost fewer than 10% of the men in the fight, and as you can see, most of the regiments performed well, including the hoplite, the Mycairophori, the cavalry, and our levy phalanx. The enemy archers I was so concerned about actually did very little, accounting for 30 kills between them. This turn, Eurydice does finally have success in stealing provisions from the Pride of Bast, although it's unclear whether they planned on moving yet. Eudokia is now outside Petra, and although there are several agent actions available, I don't find any of them particularly appealing considering what they cost, so I instead will send her towards Jerusalem so I can more quickly convert the local culture to Hellenism. I'm ready to move the Dragons of Bel-Marduk, now under the temporary leadership of Euclid, into Pontus held Amasia, but I first want to see what the neighboring factions are willing to give me in return for participating in this war. Neither Ketpatchika nor Hyastan are willing to offer monetary compensation, but Hyastan is interested in pursuing a defensive alliance for my help, so I agree to those terms.
I agree.
Now we learn why the Nabataeans and the Kidri stopped fighting. Apparently the Nabataeans were supreme and subjugated their neighbors. The now united Arabian factions turned their combined strength to the north, declaring war on the Seleukid Empire. I've not called my allies, but my satrapies are forced to join us in the war, in any event. I don't see any action from the Nabataeans themselves, but the Kidri allies have very aggressively and dangerously crossed the border, near my relatively poorly defended southern settlements of Dura and Palmyra. Unfortunately, I started my war with Pontos a little bit prematurely, and not realizing the impending threat from the south. Nevertheless, I'm going to follow through with my commitment, and Euclid brings his men in to siege out the defenders of Amasia. Again, these are mostly weak garrison infantry. While the auto-resolve isn't terrible, I could still lose over a quarter of my men, which is unacceptably high given that I have a few more battles to win before Pontus is totally subdued or annihilated. For whatever reason, my direct assault resulted in the enemy facing us outside the city rather than inside. Perhaps this was a calculated attempt on the part of the defenders to let their women and children escape the sack of the city, or perhaps they wanted to spare their property the damage from fighting. Whatever the reason, I think they've handed us the advantage since I've got more cavalry and of course the insanely strong elephant cataphracts, who can really run roughshod over an enemy on open ground.
Hold here, men. Javelins at the ready. Look at that armed rabble across the field. I would not have burned their homes, but here they are drawing us away from the settlement. It's a brave but misguided gesture. This would have gone easier if the king were here. He is stern but merciful, but me, I'm an unknown quantity. I could be a tyrant, a sadist, or a madman. I'm none of those things, I'll have it be known. When these men flee the carnage, and they will, you may be prepared to retire from the fight. Let them gather their wits, and I'm sure the fear of imminent death will have greatly increased the appeal of a peaceful surrender.
The two armies are lined up across from one another, in an area of low hills and sparse forest, with the hills and the forest being off to the right, on the eastern half of the map. I'm covering most of the open area adjacent to the road with infantry preceded by skirmishers, while my elephants and light cavalry are in the forest at the top of the southeastern hill. The Pontic force is in no hurry to rush out and meet me, and they hold their ranks steady as my infantry line advances up the center, and the elephants and light cavalry close in on their eastern flank. My archers just begin to close to the arrow range, which causes the Pontus line to spring into action, moving forward as their skirmishers and mine exchange volleys. Euclid is leading the left flank, which is composed of his own royal peltasts backing up a detachment of Cappadocian spear levies. I have a definite ranged advantage on the front line, so as my Cappadocian spears wrap around toward the enemy's left flank, their main force barrels toward the central line of phalanges in pike wall formation. The archers continue to shower the oncoming garrison and local spearmen with arrows as they close the distance, retreating at the last minute to the safety behind the pike phalanx. The elephants and the cavalry have by this time reached the enemy flank and rear respectively, and Euclid orders his flanking force of Cappadocian levies forward to close the opposite part of the pincher on the now surrounded enemy army. The Gallic cavalry crash into the enemy ranged units, who are almost instantly destroyed while the enemy spearmen and their garrison commanders struggle against the pike wall in the center. I'm finally able to get Euclid's royal peltasts around the flank and issue a charge into the enemy rear, as his men unleash a devastating volley of precursor javelins into the badly outclassed local militia. Euclid barely makes contact before the first of the two local militia regiments run for their lives. Another javelin toss and a short charge into the adjacent Pontic militia also has this unit wavering before long, and the cavalry, having finished off the archers, rear-charge the enemy general and his accompanying spear regiment. I'm leery of involving the elephants by this point, since it could just as easily result in deaths among my own men, given the beast's propensity to go berserk in melee, so they just sit back and let the mahouts launch a few arrows into the enemy rear. It's only a few more seconds of one-sided carnage before the battle is mercifully ended, and given that we're fighting a garrison army, I don't feel like there's any need to run them down, so I end the battle. A sterling first battle for Euclid leading in Antiochos' stead, losing only a fraction of his men and routing the enemy in a decisive battle. Lots of kills for the cavalry and the royal peltasts, and a respectable show by the phalanges as well. This has resulted in a rank up for both the army itself and its new commander. At Amasia, the culture is already sufficiently Hellenized to allow me to recruit a very large variety of units. One in particular, which is very interesting and which seems to be specific to this area, are the Phrygian axemen, who have quite excellent melee stats and seem to have pretty good armor and morale for this stage of the game as well. I decide these are too good to pass up, so I hire a couple of them, disbanding a Cappadocian levy to make room in the army. Eudokia has spotted Nabataeans approaching Jerusalem at the border with Petra. A moderate-sized army called the Merchants of Death, consisting of numerous spear infantry and some skirmishers. Eurydice heads west into the heart of Egypt, although I still haven't found any particular source of Ptolemaic military strength, even between their capital city of Alexandria or the nearby city of Memphis. However, even without a supporting army, the city garrison by itself is quite large and possibly able to withstand a direct assault from a moderate-sized attacking army. Pontus strike back during their turn, laying siege to the Armenian-held lands to the east, while a much smaller Pontic army launches an attack to recapture Amasia, which so recently became ours. With the garrison still quite depleted, I can't really oppose even so small an army, although I'm surprised that Euclid, who is immediately adjacent to the city, was not able to reinforce. It's possible that this was a night battle, or perhaps I moved him a bit too far outside the city. In any event, I'm forced to cede our recent acquisition right back to its original owners. Next, the Nabataean Merchants of Death make an assault against Antiochos II and the Thunderbolts of Zeus at Jerusalem. The edge is given to the enemy in the balance bar, and our own garrison, still quite a ways to replenish before they're large enough to be effective, are going to be of no help whatsoever. I've decided to fight this battle manually, and see if I can pull out a victory for young Antiochus in the face of adversity. The enemy force is almost entirely spearmen, which is good for our swordsmen and bad for our cavalry. The less numerous, more heavily armed infantry pictured are the Nabataean medium spears, who, although slightly weak on the attack, still have a reasonable charge bonus and have excellent defensive stats and armor. The more lightly armored foes are Bedouin spears, who are essentially lower-tier levy spearmen. There's also a sprinkling of Arabian spearmen, and the general's powerful Natarin bodyguard infantry, while their skirmishers are some average-quality slingers. We're defending the northern side of the map, and the enemy have a slight elevation advantage, as they'll be coming downhill at us. I'm weighting my formation toward the left, where I put most of the swordsmen, while my phalanges and hoplites will try to hold off the enemy charge from the right and center. Immediately following deployment, Oriaspoke, the Nabataean general starts shifting his line to match mine, and I keep moving left to keep my strength on that flank. His men are colliding with our pikes at a sort of odd oblique charge, but the enemy do some elaborate maneuvering on our left flank to avoid getting embroiled in combat with the melee infantry, which is actually quite good tactics on their part, keeping me occupied without actually committing to a fight. Eventually, my Hyrcanian hillmen and Machaerophori tangle with the Mukrabe spearmen on the left, and although we theoretically have an advantage in terms of armament, the Nabataean spears are so heavily armored that they can take a lot more punishment than my own melee infantry. I launch a flank assault into one of the Mukrabe units with my light cavalry, but they seem to come out worse for this engagement, and I'm forced to frantically withdraw the 2nd Cavalry Regiment before the oncoming Free Regiment of Nabataean spears. The Nabataeans not only have expert charge defense, but they're also armed with some very nasty precursor missiles, and my cavalry receive a really vicious volley in the rear as they're maneuvering around the enemy flank. Young Antiochos adds his Warcry, Inspire, and Second Wind abilities to bolster our men, who are really up to their necks against these Mukrabe spearmen. Antiochos' retinue of companions demand the attention of the front of the enemy spearmen, and 2,000 years before an English lord with a compulsive gambling habit thought of it, Antiochos makes the very first sandwich in history, smashing the Mukrabe spears between his 2 cavalry regiments. Another regiment of Mukrabe, in the brawl on the left with my swordsmen, are losing their taste for the fight, while the Bedouin spears in the center are wavering, and another is already literally running for the hills to the south. Now I thought by this point that we had the battle coming quickly under control, but the Mukrabe spearmen stubbornly refused to break, and in fact they not only hold their own against the front and rear cavalry assault of Antiochos, but they severely punish the light cavalry attacking them. Additionally, by now the Nabataean general has joined his men against my pikes, and here he has the advantage, with the Nataran bodyguard probably the strongest unit on the battlefield. I pull out my other light cavalry from the brawl to charge in and help Antiochos, but even with 3 cavalry regiments fighting them, these Mukrabe spearmen just keep dishing out the punishment, breaking the initial light cavalry unit who charged them in the rear. With the Machaerophori and hillmen slowly but surely defeating the enemy cluster on the left, I pull out a regiment of hillmen to assist Antiochos, and then maneuver the light cavalry toward the enemy rear for another charge. Even Antiochos' elite retinue is starting to suffer significant casualties, as I still can't seem to wrap up the fight on the left, and Aryasboke has battered his way through the pikes, taking only a single casualty as a result. With about half my cavalry remaining, Antiochos has finally freed himself from the painful engagement with the enemy spearmen, and he heads off to try to cut off the enemy retreat and contain their skirmishers. Aryasboke, meanwhile, has punched a gigantic hole in the center of my line, and he next rams his very heavy elite spear regiment into the flank of my adjacent pikemen, while my men on the right are starting to fall under the pressure of overwhelming enemy numbers, as I just didn't expect the engagement on the left to become such a quagmire. With another rallying cry from Antiochos, my light cavalry crash into the enemy general, with the melee regiments, weakened but victorious, following closely on their heels. Antiochos works his way through the enemy backfield, crushing some fleeing Bedouins, but losing a few of his own horsemen to a nearby regiment of Mukrabe, who broke but didn't rout completely. As Antiochos careens into the rear of the Bedouin spearmen and enemy slingers assaulting our right flank, the Mukrabe give up their chase and settle down to fight my hillmen. However, so vicious is the slaughter instigated by Antiochos' rear assault on the enemy position on the right flank that the battle turns radically in our favor, the enemy morale having reached the tipping point, and as the enemy retreat cascades across the battlefield, we've secured victory just in the nick of time, as most of our units are now below half strength, and Antiochos himself has been subjected to much more risk than I would have liked. I spend a little time chasing after the fleeing Nabataeans and Bedouins to ensure they don't bother us again soon, but the lack of available cavalry limits the effectiveness of my pursuit. We lost about 40% of our force in this battle, certainly many more than I had anticipated given the apparently bland and uninteresting composition of the enemy army. But they met my strong left-handed formation almost perfectly, with their heavily armed spears really holding back my flanking attempt for quite a while. Things might have gone even worse had Aryasboke struck sooner with his elite bodyguard. Unfortunately, this victory appears to be only a temporary respite, as no sooner has the Nabataean army fled than they're replaced by another who appear from the border with Petra, while the Kidru move in dangerously close to Dura. We get a huge attrition report, losing men from all of our garrison armies and the Hammers of Hephaestos. This is the sort of thing you might expect from bankruptcy or global food shortage, although neither of these things has happened, and once again the game provides me with no details as to the source of the attrition, so I'm left wondering. With so many enemies threatening, and the thunderbolts of Zeus in relatively poor shape, I withdraw the army to inside the walls of Jerusalem to lick their wounds. I'm hopeful that a turn or two of replenishment will enable young Antiochos to go back on the offensive. Meanwhile, I suspect I can hold off an enemy settlement assault if need be. The approaching Nabataean force is only partially visible, but I can see a similar composition including Nabataean and Bedouin spears. There's also at least one regiment of camels, so this could be an even tougher fight than the last one. Euclid returns to take Amasia, and I opt for the auto-resolve to speed things up, losing perhaps 20% of the army. This eliminates the Pontus army entirely, but sadly I wasn't able to get my Phrygian axemen last turn when the settlement changed hands. With his kingdom in dire circumstances, Antiochos Soter still has yet to return from his injuries, and while his son wages war on two fronts and seals Syria, and his steadfast companion Euclid continues the work of bringing Asia Minor under Seleukid control, Kidri forces creep into Mesopotamia from the south, bent on destruction at Dura, well ahead of Diogenes or any other Seleukid reinforcements. Whether the king will return to an empire in peril to once again play the role of savior of the kingdom, or young Antiochos II will be able to hold back the tide of enemies on his own, are questions to be answered in the next episode of the Astronomical Apocrypha.